Okay, we're live again. We'll wait a few seconds here for a few visitors to show up, and then we will get going. For everybody who's watching this, if you are watching on replay, thank you very much for coming to find this. We've got other videos on our YouTube and Facebook page. We are playing tonight here. This is a continuation. This is the finale, the grand finale, we'll call it, or round 3 of the Battle of Midway. We've been challenging the National Naval Aviation Museum to this game. We played the first 2 sessions. We started the first one on the anniversary of the Battle of Midway, and we're just going to be finishing it up here tonight. And using the game order of battle, which you can see on the screen here. So we'll wait just a few more seconds, starting to get a few people filtering, and then we'll get underway. All right, so we've got a crowd starting to show up here. So yeah, let's go ahead and get underway. So my name's Rob Doan. I'm the curator of the Naval War College Museum. And joining me again, my trusty opponents from the National Naval Aviation Museum are Jared Galloway.
Good evening.
And Mark Levitt on the bottom of the screen there.
Hey, everybody.
And as I said again, yeah, we're going to be finishing up this game that we started a few weeks ago. So we're refighting the Battle of Midway. And as we're playing here, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the things in each of our museums that relate to the battle, show off a little bit of what we have in our collections, and just talk a little bit about the kind of what our museums do in terms of how it relates to this battle and telling naval history. We've each had a chance in the past to show a few artifacts from our museum, so we'll do a little bit of that again, and hopefully just talk a little bit about tactics and strategy and how it relates to Midway, and how things are going differently here than they did in the historical battle. At this point, we've diverged pretty substantially from the historic results, so it's going to be fun to see how this develops here. So, Jared, you've got the screen loaded up there, I see. Do you want to go ahead and give everyone a quick overview of where things stand at this point in the game?
Sure. So right now, the Japanese fleet, which started in different parts, has slowly converged on Midway. I've got one force directly to the west, and then this other group down to the southwest. Rob, at this point, has looks like a cruiser line to the south of Midway, and then he also has the smaller force. Looks like a cruiser and a destroyer to the north. So I guess he's just trying to block me in both directions at this point. I'm going to start the replay and see what he did on the last turn.
So yeah, for anybody who's not familiar with this game, it's kind of meant to be played by email. We're making it work as a live program just by playing the turns and switching it over to the other person. But at the end of every turn, you'll see a replay of what happened on the last turn. The other important thing to keep in mind is that as you, the audience, are watching, you are seeing our screens. We, Jared and I, do not see each other's units unless we've spotted them, unless we have our own units close enough to spot the other side's units. So when it's my turn, I'm only going to see what my guys have spotted, and likewise with Jared. So if you're watching the audience, you're going to get the whole picture just by, if you watch long enough. When you watch one of his turns, you watch one of my turns, you'll see where all of our units are. But Jared and I don't quite have all of that because things are coming to a head here. He's got his fleet getting pretty close to Midway. We have spotted a lot more now, but as far as I know, I don't think, Jared, you've spotted any of the American carriers yet.
Not yet, no.
Okay, so there is that kind of big, that big notable exception out there, but that's probably gonna come changing here pretty soon. As you're watching in the audience, please feel free to comment along the way, post your ideas for tactics and what you think we should do. You'll start to kind of get the picture as we get into the game here in the next turn or two. We're starting turn 10. You can see down there in the bottom right-hand corner, there are 16 turns in this, so we've got 6 more turns to play out. My objective as the Americans, I'm just trying to keep him off of Midway. If he lands on Midway, that's his primary objective in this game, so he'll win. As my primary objective, if he doesn't get on Midway, then I win. So that's the main thing. As a secondary objective, we each have a goal to knock out the other side's carriers as well. So, but if you don't hold on to Midway, then those secondary objectives are just kind of, nice bonuses, but they don't count as a win in the game. So we've, I think we had a first few turns where we're trying to just mainly send some recon aircraft and use our submarines to try and find the other fleets, and we managed that a little bit, but we have not quite had the main carrier clashes that are the hallmark of the Battle of Midway. I think those are probably be coming pretty soon, but we haven't quite had them yet. We've got to have a lot more surface action, actually. This is kind of how it's diverged, I would say, for the most part so far, is that the surface fleets on both sides that really did not see any action in the actual battle are having it out here. So the invasion force for the Japanese has gotten much closer to the battle, or to Midway Island than they managed to do in reality.
And Rob, you had mentioned the last couple of sessions when you guys were sort of trying to find each other's fleets, how that really mirrored, really searching and trying to understand what it would be like putting yourselves in those shoes of searching this big open space and trying to see where that fleet was. And now that you've spotted quite a bit of each other's fleet, it's a very different game. It's a very different situation right now, sure.
It definitely is. Yeah, I mean, we have the luxury of working with a map that is is a defined limited space, so it's not like we have to search the entire Central Pacific Ocean or hundreds and hundreds of nautical miles of actual space. So but even when there's a limited game map like this, for me at least, there was quite a bit of tension in the beginning. I knew that I wanted to find, I wasn't sure if Jared was going to have the Japanese kind of separated in the 4 groups that they historically had, kind of working separately and trying to converge, or if he might have everything all in one together, or some different organization. We weren't beholden to any of that. We were free to do as we pleased here. So we're just trying our own plan here to see how this works out. And Jared, it's probably worth mentioning that you have already wiped out the garrison of Midway itself. That is a key point, we should say, if you haven't seen it yet. You were able to use your aircraft to bomb the airfield on Midway and take out the aircraft that were there. And then I did have a small garrison that was represented by a coastal gun on one of those hexes on Midway Island, which you also destroyed. So at this point, if you get any of your troop ships to Midway, you're going to be able to walk onto the beach unopposed, which is obviously less than ideal from the American perspective. So I am completely relying on the Navy at this point to try and defend Midway Island itself.
And that's the way I like it.
I think it's safe to say that up to this point, things have progressed probably very much the way Yamamoto would have wished that it would have, as opposed to how it actually did up to this point. You can see kind of on the map here that this game uses a hex-based map to show, to define the movement on the map. So anytime you're moving a piece, you've got basically 6 directions that it moves into. You can see that hex grid kind of superimposed on the water here. And that I'm watching in here, Jared, since at this point we probably don't have too much hidden information left. But as I'm seeing as you scroll around there, you'll see the units that are spotted that show up. Sometimes you'll see like a blinking icon that shows just like the silhouette of a ship, where that's indicating to that player that they have spotted something in that general area, but haven't moved anybody close enough to really identify it precisely. Good to see AJ joining us again. AJ Orlikoff from the National Museum of the U.S. Army, who was one of our previous opponents in this program. Good to have you back, AJ. One of the questions that had come in last time, and I was looking at too, was about Midway, and we had talked a little bit about wargaming at the Naval War College and how many times they rehearsed, the war with Japan through wargaming at the college. And I was trying to find out what if they had ever played a scenario at the college where they had, or anything that actually took place around Midway, if Midway itself factored into college games at the Naval War College. And as far as I can tell so far, they didn't have anything that where Midway played a central feature in the game. It certainly appeared on the maps that they used, and they had certainly identified it as a geographic feature where they might want to, think about planning an advance through that area, fortifying it more than it even was in the starting to look at fortifying it in the 1930s. But it wasn't, they certainly didn't figure that this was going to be the place where they would have the major fleet engagement that they necessarily were planning on, to where they thought they might settle the war all in one big climactic battle. So that part itself is just kind of interesting, of how wargaming at the college certainly prepared them to think about the war in large terms. It didn't mean that they predicted every single thing that would happen throughout the war, but it certainly gave them a good idea of the areas they might be fighting over, and how that would dictate strategy overall.
And I'm kicking it back to you now, Rob.
Okay. All right, let me send it over to my screen and I'll get loaded up. Yeah, at this point, knowing the situation around Midway Island, I'm starting to get sort of into hanging on mode here and see if I can run out the clock and make it to turn 16. All right, so this is where it's giving me this replay here. Everything that happens in this replay is what you just saw if you were watching Jared's turn. So I'm just gonna kind of fast forward this so I can get to the point where I can start moving. But I can definitely see where our looks like the invasion force is trying to, do a number on the few ships that are guarding Midway Island there. Looks like I don't have much time left for them to look for those troop ships if they're going to do anything to them. All right, let's get through all that. We've seen that already. So I'm zooming in on Midway Island here. So it looks like you already took out a destroyer there. And one of my cruisers is pretty badly beat up. So here's what I'm seeing right now. I know if you were just watching Jared's screen, you kind of saw what was out in this area, but you'll see now that's a little too far away from my surface ships. And I don't have any aircraft here to go out there and fly. So I just know that something is out there, but I've lost sight of exactly what it is right now. So here's his cruiser screen. I can see he's probably trying to protect his troop ships from me. So I'm going to, let's see. move out here and just see if I can. There we go. All right. So you can see I now have spotted at least a couple of these troop ships. Let me start shooting at those guys. The amount of firepower that he's got coming in here, unfortunately, this screen of mine, these cruisers are, geez, I sort of feel like I'm in a little bit of a situation like the Battle of Leyte Gulf here with a small screen confronting a huge Japanese force coming on. I'm a little bit better than than that task force with Taffy 3 at Leyte Gulf, but I've got a little bit more firepower than they did with these cruisers here, but still. For the moment, I'm basically going to try to ignore these Japanese warships and concentrate almost exclusively on the troop ships, because they really are the main thing for me. If I can keep them away from Midway Island, then they'll have done their job. Let's see. Let's move. Oh, here we go. All right. So here's an important piece of information. Now we've got the two carriers up here as well. So at this point, see, this is really tempting for me. So this is the cruiser New Orleans, and I'm awfully tempted to take a shot at his carriers. I mean, getting a surface ship to bring their main battery into action against a carrier is certainly tempting. But I've always got to keep in mind that if I don't keep these troop ships away from Midway Island, then nothing else is really going to matter. So I almost feel compelled to stay on those troop ships as much as I would like to start putting holes in the hull of a Japanese carrier. I think I'm going to stay down here.
Rob, in the game, does the fact that there's intervening ships affect your ability to hit those carriers?
It does not. These hexes represent a fairly large amount of ocean. The scale varies a little bit depending on the particular scenario that we're playing. So I don't have a certain, at the scale here that we're probably talking at least like 10 nautical miles per hex. So there's a pretty good amount of space that would actually be represented here where you might not actually be firing over. Just the hex grid kind of, artificially makes these ships align where they wouldn't necessarily be in the way in reality. So it's kind of an artifact of the fact we are using this hex map. All right, well, you saw down here, this is basically, and I think Jared has seen this already too, so I'm not giving away too much by showing. So here's the American aircraft coming in to see what they can do. And we've got carriers in range, so I think I'm gonna come in here and start sending my aircraft in to see if we can take out a flat top or two. Yeah, he does have a lot of supporting ships around his carriers, so unfortunately for me, that means he's got a lot of anti-aircraft fire that can help. Let's see, fly off here. We're working on, let's see, looks like, yeah, okay, it's the Akagi here. So that is, didn't have enough left to hit him though. All right. We do have our torpedo bombers too, which of course didn't do as well historically. I'm gonna bring him in here. I don't think he's not gonna, basically at this range that I'm flying them in from, they don't quite have enough room left to attack. They can get pretty close, but I think I'm going to have to wait until next turn for them to really be able to have a shot at these carriers. So let's may as well take a shot at them as I'm coming in here and take out some of the destroyer screen. That would be helpful. Yeah, I'm like just not quite able to to reach. I'm flying in at maximum range here. So, all right, well, we're going to have to wait until next turn for this airstrike to really hit home, hopefully. But, oh, no, I think I do have. All right, well, there's a target that's worthy. That's a troop ship. So I may as well take a shot at him for sure. Boy, that's a lot of anti-aircraft fire coming in, though. And you have zeros that are prowling. So not sure how long this airstrike is going to survive, but we'll see. Okay. So let's see. I've got a couple more small surface ships here that are coming in to help. So I'll bring them up and all right, I am going to kick this back over to you, Jared. We had talked last time about our submarines getting maybe a little bit more use out of them at this point. I know my submarines, I think spotted at least one of your groupings coming in there, so they did give me a little bit of advance information. I'm not sure that the Japanese submarines did much for you, Jared. I may be wrong about that, but that would be kind of par for the course for them, unfortunately.
Other than I-168. So let's see what Rob's been doing.
Yeah, I have kind of a woefully inadequate picket line down there by Midway that I'm hoping to get in a few licks on your troop ships before. Let's see if they can last at least another turn to maybe take out a troop ship or two. But you do have an awful lot of firepower there, and then there's your battleship that's coming in as well to knock them about.
That's a lot of fireworks there.
It was, I know. It's kind of intimidating looking at all of it coming up there.
All right, so first thing I need to do is try to get rid of probably this guy, I guess.
Do you have a particular invasion beach already picked out, Jared, that you're looking at? Since you have your pick here.
Whichever one presents itself.
The one that the airfield had a hangar on it, which I think would have blocked you from landing there. But since you've destroyed it, of course, I think it's pretty much all open beach at this point.
Yeah, probably.
I would say one of the things that sort of is planning out or is playing out that I think the way, at least the way that the U.S. Navy expected that it would, in terms of them guessing what the Japanese mindset would be. They always expected in the war games at the War College, when Nimitz and King were coming through, they always expected the Japanese were trying to set up, this climactic battle somewhere, probably in the Central Pacific or maybe in the Western Pacific. And the idea is that the Japanese submarines and aircraft would kind of whittle away at the American fleet as it approached. When American strategic thinkers were originally thinking that this was going to be sort of a one-shot deal where the fleet would just sail across the Pacific and find the main fleet eventually and then have this battle. They expected the Japanese to try to sort of whittle away at them, and they realized through wargaming that just the process of transiting the vast spaces of the Pacific would lead to things like breakdowns. Mechanical ships would have to go into port to repair, but then on top of that, they might encounter submarines, maybe an aircraft carrier here and there that would find them and launch a raid. And the whole thinking was that the Japanese would do that to just wear down the American fleet, so that by the time it arrived to where they were going to have this main battle, they would have already been weakened so much that the Japanese would have a huge advantage. So I sort of feel like that is, well, you've definitely done that, Jared, with the Midway garrison itself. The American carriers themselves are still in pretty good shape, but the surface fleet is not, and you've definitely used your aircraft, to get some pretty substantial losses here, even before we got into range to start exchanging gunfire. So, in that regard, I'd say you're operating as the Americans expected that the Japanese would, at least as they were developing the war plans.
Having a really hard time seeing the health on some of these aircraft.
Oh, here's a good question too. Historically, how important was the invasion viewed with respect to the importance of destroying the American carriers? So I guess the question being for the Japanese, how importantly did they weigh taking Midway as opposed to destroying the American carriers? I'll say a little bit about this, Jared, and maybe if you want to pop into after your turn while I'm moving. But I would say there was actually some initial disagreement about that on the Japanese side. The whole impetus for this, you can kind of trace this back to the Doolittle raid, the surprise and the shock of that. Even though the raid itself caused very little damage to Japan, it made the Japanese leadership realize that the Navy is operating close enough to home that they can actually strike us. So the Naval General Staff starts to formulate plans to expand their perimeter and try and push the American perimeter back so they wouldn't be able to do things like in the future. And much of this operation is absolutely designed to lure the Americans out, and they certainly wanted and expected that this would lure the American carriers out so that they could be destroyed. The value of Midway Island itself was up for debate. Some on the Japanese side felt strongly that the island really, even though it would have come in handy, it was also problematic because of how far it was from mainland Japan. We're talking at least a couple thousand nautical miles from Japan. Very difficult to supply. You have a very long supply chain that would have needed to be established just to keep a garrison and supply there. On the American side, certainly Nimitz was arguing that, even in the worst case scenario, if Midway fell, it probably wouldn't be too difficult to retake. They could kind of regroup, retrain, regroup, and get their losses back, and then take the island back at some point in the future. So the value of the island itself was probably less on both sides than the actual real prize, which was the carriers for both sides. The interesting thing, I think, from the Japanese side is there was almost this sort of the thinking didn't quite align, because on the one hand, many of the senior leaders felt, including Yamamoto's chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, felt that the Americans lacked the aggressive will to fight. And one of the reasons the Japanese were surprised at Midway is because they really didn't expect the Americans to come out, certainly not try to approach on the flank and surprise them, but they really didn't think that they were going to come out and try and challenge this too much. But on the other hand, their entire plan for this was to lure the Americans to come out, and they absolutely thought that they were going to do that. So nobody on the Japanese side could really explain how it was that the Americans would fall for this trap and come out to fight, and yet they still lacked the aggressive will to fight in the first place. They were kind of contradictory ideas there, but I think that all relates to kind of Japanese overconfidence in the initial stage of the war, which we were talking about a little bit in our last session too. That was a good discussion.
And Rob, since you mentioned the Doolittle raid, I'll just give a little prop to the Naval Air Station in our museum down here. The Doolittle raiders had their final training in the Eglin Air Force Base, which is just north of us here in Pensacola. Lieutenant Miller, who was from NAS Pensacola, actually oversaw their training. We have his training notes on all the flyers here at the museum in the archive. And we've even done up a B-25 that is inside the museum of how it would have looked for those flying off the Hornet.
Yeah, very nice. Were you there when I suppose the B-25 probably predates you at the museum, but were you there when they brought it into the museum, or is it older than that?
Actually, it was relatively, I was there when they were finishing it up. Yeah, and our museum has a very large atrium where it has this big glass door that goes up, and they brought it in, and then it was actually quite fascinating to watch them move and maneuver all the other planes that were already in the building in order to fit this much larger aircraft comparatively. And I mean, we're talking within a foot, going through pylons and around other aircraft. They're very meticulous and very very detail oriented to be able to move that in. So it was pretty great, pretty great day.
Neat. Yeah, if you haven't been to the Naval War College Museum, our museum is in a building built in 1820 as a poorhouse for the town of Newport, and was later converted to the Naval War College. But we unfortunately do not have an aircraft hangar-sized building for our collection, so we're not able to have the kind of artifacts like that Mark has down there. But we concentrate more on the strategic side of naval thinking and planning, and although we do have some fairly neat pieces of some artifacts related to World War II and technology-related pieces. Our collection, I guess you would say, is a little more cerebral, or a little bit more sort of on the intellectual side of Navy planning than necessarily the technology side.
How about I kicked it back to you, Rob?
Oh, great. Yep, great. I'm loading it up. Do you want to say anything, Jared, real quick, about the value of Midway Island versus the value of taking out the carriers?
Well, I think I was sort of concentrating on what I was doing, but I recalled you saying that really for them, the impetus for Midway was sort of like the impetus for capturing the Aleutians, that it was denying the Americans that particular base of operations and extending their ability to basically watch the Pacific to make sure that there wasn't a repeat of something like the Doolittle raid. Mm-hmm. And I think Mr. Nasuti commented on that. I don't remember if it was our first or second session, but he did bring that up. And I do think in one of those sessions, we also mentioned that for the Americans, losing Midway wasn't necessarily seen as a catastrophic failure for the same reasons that the Aleutians wasn't, because once you capture a base that far on your perimeter, do you have the logistical infrastructure to support it, which, of course, the Japanese at that point really didn't.
Yeah, that's yeah, I definitely agree with that. Let's see here. So at this point, I'm seeing Japanese troop ships are, boy, within 4 hexes or so of Midway. So things are getting critical here. I'm wondering if no, this poor cruiser has 1 point of damage left. Oh, we got in 1 hit on your troop ship here, so I'm gonna see if I can. And take a shot at 1 troop ship here, and I think I'm going to finish it off. All right. Well, I got rid of 1 of them. So I feel okay about that. Let's see. I'm trying to pick out the troop ships in this whole mess of, we've got the fleet's so converged here that things are getting pretty chaotic now.
For everyone you sink, 2 more shall take its place.
I don't think the Japanese had quite that industrial capacity, but
And that's the great thing about alternative timelines.
Exactly. All right, that pretty much takes care of anybody by the Midway force. All right, so now the part I've been waiting for here. Now let's see what we can do with what we can do with the air power. Let's see. All right, we're sending some torpedoes into the Akagi. Now, I do have some of your fighters that I'm trying to ward off here too. This airstrike does have a little bit of an escort with it, but let's see. Unfortunately, as I'm hovering over it, you can see here how the game shows some of the the differences in the aircraft. So this is a VF3, the Wildcat squadron, the squadron F4F Wildcats, and then these are the zeros here that I'm coming behind. And you can see on as I'm hovering over it here, it shows how much the damage number on the left is how much damage I will cause if I shoot. But if I do, I'm going to probably take the number on the right, the damage, the 4. So it looks like I would be only causing 2 damage versus taking 4, which shows pretty well the advantage that the Zero had over the Wildcat in terms of its quality as a fighter. So there's only so much I can do to kind of keep them off of the rest of the aircraft in this airstrike here.
Which does track pretty well historically with what actually happened to VF3.
Exactly.
I think this was one of our topics we had mentioned maybe bringing up in this round since we hadn't really discussed it in any detail before, but that, of course, was the contribution of the USS Yorktown's air group. Really quite amazing because it was a hybrid air group, 2 squadrons from Yorktown's Air Group 5, and then 2 squadrons from the Saratoga's Air Group 3. So prior to this battle, those squadrons had never worked together as a cohesive force, and yet they're the only air group that found the Japanese fleet pretty much without having to look for it. They flew right to it, and were the only one that actually carried out a coordinated attack the way that it should have gone for the other 2.
All right. All right. So that was pretty good for me. I think we'll call it turn there and send it back to you.
Hey, Rob, this might be a good moment to talk about the SBD.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to? I'll share your screen here for a second.
Sure.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So one of the things as Rob was flying his aircraft around, particularly at the Naval Aviation Museum, it's often the pilots that capture the imagination when we think about those flying machines. But they are often supported by enlisted personnel and what we call backseaters. And these enlisted where there were crewmen on the decks not only kept the aircraft flying in the air, but also would protect them from those fighters that we just saw, or spotting them and using the radio. And the SBD Dauntless had a backseater who not only operated that radio, but manned the 30 caliber machine gun to fend off those enemy attackers. And we're going to talk a little bit about Aviation Radioman First Class Joseph DeLuca, who's seen right here, third from the left on the back row, who was such a backseater. And we have his logbooks, which cover his wartime service. And much like the Dauntless that we talked about last time, the 2106, it was his combat experience actually began on December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor. He was part of Scouting Squadron 6, or VS6, which flew off the USS Enterprise on a routine mission, little knowing that they would stumble across the Japanese attack that was in progress when they came into range of Hawaii. And he was one of the few that was in last to land on the airstrips in Hawaii, and then he was assigned to ground defense for the rest of that day. He continued on flying with his squadron. You can see here in February, he took part in the battles of Roy Island and Wake Island. Then and that was March as well. Apologies for that. And then in June, he was at the Battle of Midway as well, where he took part in some bombing runs on the Japanese carriers. His pilot was Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson Jr. And when the pilot finished his attack run, they were beset by enemy fighters, and the Americans were trying to make it back to their task force, but they actually ran out of fuel, so they had to ditch at sea. They did make it to the edge of the task force and were picked up by a destroyer, but it was a pretty harrowing time for them and the rest of the squadron as well. And now DeLuca went on to earn the Distinguished Flying Cross, which is a very prestigious citation here we can read. And what it says was he took all necessary steps to ward off the furious and continuous enemy attack. So again, he's in the back seat, but he's really key to keeping them in one piece and getting back to that task force. DeLuca would go on to earn his wings. That happened a fair amount with the enlisted. And so he was commissioned, and he would later earn an air medal, but this time Lieutenant Junior grade DeLuca. So his as I said, his logbook and his service are documented in our archive. And it's great for one of the things we're really pushing to do is bring the enlisted and to the sort of forefront and highlight their contributions as well, in addition to the commissioned pilots. So.
Cool. Yeah. No, thanks very much for sharing. There's a question on Facebook here too, but I want to take a stab at the counterfactual on if the Japanese had won the Battle of Midway. We love counterfactuals here, so the what if questions are good ones. I kind of mentioned already, but I touched on it a little, I think, in the last question about just, even if they had it, it kind of gives them one more place that they now have to try to keep in supply and garrisoned, and the value of the base itself. There's a couple improved airstrips that give you a place to fly aircraft from. But to what extent would that have delayed, the U.S. advance through the Central Pacific? Knowing, of course, that they take the route through the South Pacific in the immediate future after Midway, of course, going through the Solomons. I don't think there's any question it would have set back the U.S. timetable to some extent, by how much, who knows, depending on what the losses were like. I mean, if the Americans had lost another aircraft carrier, I mean, certainly, then you're talking significant delay. But, the battle itself, I think, regardless of which way it went, I mean, so many historians nowadays, certainly identify it as the turning point, or not all, but most, I think, identify it as the turning point in the Battle of the Pacific. Certainly at the time it happened, it was recognized as a very significant battle, a huge victory for the Americans, and a welcome turn of events to the way the war had gone through the first few months. But at the same time, nobody at that time was saying, well, that's it. It's all downhill, smooth sailing from here. It's just a matter of time. We have to wear down the Japanese. Certainly nobody was thinking that way. So, and even after the horrendous losses that the Japanese take in losing 4 carriers and all the air crew and all the mechanics and the things that really hurt them, they could never replace. Even in spite of all that, they're able to contest the American advance through the Solomons and wage carrier battles even a few months after this, where they still outnumber the Americans. So as rough a battle as Midway was for the Japanese, as a significant victory it was, regardless if it had gone that way, if it had been more of if the Japanese had eked out a victory or had caused more losses than they inflicted. Certainly, in the long-term view, I think pretty much everyone agrees the industrial advantage of the U.S. was going to come into play ultimately. By this point, again, not to minimize all the fighting that still had to be done, but the long-term view was just not in the Japanese favor. That the industrial capacity of the U.S. to outproduce and just send a massive fleet across the Pacific was going to happen eventually. It's just kind of a question of how soon that advantage could really be felt. And I think a Japanese victory at Midway probably would have made that happen later than it did, but it ultimately would not have changed the ultimate course of the war. Oh, let's see. Sorry, Jared, let me kick it over to your screen here. There we go. If you watched any of the first sessions, you probably saw the American B-17s on Midway, which you can see on the screen here. There is one of them left. They in this battle, as in reality, they didn't do much in terms of causing damage to the Japanese fleet, but they did provide pretty good service in terms of being a reconnaissance tool. So for me, using those in the beginning to kind of scout these Western approaches to Midway was pretty helpful to at least start to get the feel for what was out there.
Always nice to finish off a destroyer with carrier guns.
Now that's a highlight of the game worth showing if a carrier's guns come into play as a battle winning tool. Which carrier was that, Jared, that you just used to sink an American destroyer?
It was the Hiryu.
Okay. All right. Well, we're definitely into solid what if territory now. So that's the neat thing about playing these games, is to be able to have some not just experiment with different strategies, but sometimes see some things that really wildly diverge from historical events. So we basically have two big fur balls, I would say, developing at this point. We kind of have the action around Midway and trying to keep the Japanese fleet away from there, and then the American airstrike that's targeting these carriers over here. So we've having approach from a couple different directions now. The fight is developing, and Jared, I sort of get the feeling that you're pretty much just ignoring my carriers. Is it safe to say that at this point?
Not really. I just haven't figured out where they are. I've got a pretty good scouting screen. They've slipped through it somehow.
Well, I at least feel good about the fact they've stayed hidden, although I'm not going to get any points in the game just for keeping them hidden. If they don't accomplish anything of value, then in game purposes, then they won't have really have served my interests. But I at least feel good that they're not being swarmed by your aircraft. So. One of the things I think we touched on a little bit last time too was about some of the terms that are used to describe Midway. It's been described, and there's a book with the title called Miracle of Midway, and it's the victory over the Japanese fleet is described in miraculous terms, and that it was sort of this David and Goliath type of counter, where the heavily outnumbered American fleet meets this powerful Japanese force, and through a combination of just blind dumb luck and good fortune and American pluckiness, that they're able to sort of reverse the tide here and have this smashing victory where they take out the 4 Japanese carriers and basically put Japan on the defensive for the rest of the war. And I know we wanted to talk a little bit about that tonight in terms of, is that a good description for Midway? Does the term miracle, is that a good word to use, or a helpful word to describe to the fleet or the battle here? And we can go into this as the night goes on here a little bit, but one thing that kind of brought that to mind is I'm looking at my carriers, or my aircraft, starting to hit these Japanese carriers. The game does encourage you to try and hit, if you are bombing or torpedoing a carrier that has aircraft on it, you're going to cause more damage to the ship. The thought being that if it has aircraft on it, it's going to have things like fuel, weapons, ordnance that are going to cook off if they are, if flames are getting near them, that might be caused by bomb damage. And so that causes those ships to sink and take damage much more quickly. Some of the early accounts of the battle, when the history of Midway was being written early on, relied on some reports that were later found to not really be true. But for a long time, it was kind of thought that the main, the American the attacks by the American dive bombers that caused the first 3 first 3 Japanese carriers to sink. For a long time, it was kind of taken from some of the Japanese accounts of the battle that those carriers had aircraft that were armed and fueled and ready, that were sitting on the decks, and that were just minutes or even seconds away from taking off to go find the American fleet and theoretically destroy it, and that it was just because of this last minute attack by American dive bombers that had just happened to find the Japanese fleet sort of by luck that averted all that from happening. And later scholarship has shown that wasn't true, that the Japanese aircraft were certainly preparing, and that Nagumo was getting ready to send them out to try and find the Yorktown specifically, when they were first looking at launching attacks on the Yorktown. But they weren't sitting out there on the deck ready. They were actually much further away and needed more time to be ready than what was originally thought. So some of that kind of changes over the years, as reports, subsequent after-action reports, kind of show the truth of that. You can see that it was not quite as close run a thing as it was sometimes described. But that's one, kind of way in which we might say that, it's not quite a miracle, and maybe not always be quite the right term to describe this. Would you say that's, or do you have other examples of that, Jared, that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the state of their carriers, I mean, it really is worth looking at the, I guess, sort of the cascade of leadership decisions, how they compound on each other and sort of create that situation. You have Nagumo, who I think is fairly typically criticized for being certainly not an aggressive officer. But I would say that probably another common criticism is that he doesn't have a lot of imagination. And, I don't know whether that would be considered a personal characteristic, a product of the military culture of his time, or maybe both of those factors sort of feeding into each other. But it's interesting to me that, certainly after the Pearl Harbor raid, he would typically justify his decisions by saying that he was, following his orders. He was doing what he was ordered to do, no more, no less. And then at Midway, going into that first strike, he is specifically ordered by Admiral Yamamoto to keep half of his force in reserve. So for the Akagi and Kaga, that's their torpedo planes. For Soryu and Hiryu, that's their dive bombers. The first wave takes off, and while it's gone, he gets the first sighting report of a task force, starts the process of switching his reserve force from bombs because he was getting ready to fly the second strike at Midway, then switches back when they get the sighting report of the American carrier. And then, of course, by the time they're doing that, the planes from Midway are starting to show up, and they keep dragging out the rearmament process. By the time they repel those, he's got to decide whether to land the Midway strike, rearm it, and then send everything after the carriers, or go ahead and launch immediately. And, of course, he decides to wait and try to rearm everything and send off an entire strike. And all of this comes back to the fact that for whatever reason, having insisted on following orders all along, he's basically in this mess for disobeying a direct order from Yamamoto. And to me, that's just like I said, an interesting cascade that comes back from that one decision where he did something that I think most people would say was uncharacteristic of Nagumo. And I do apologize to our. I'm sorry, Mark. What did you say?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to apologize for the audience. It's very difficult for me at this point, having done all those movements, to get back into kind of the detached academic mindset after that.
No, that was all good. No worries.
No, you can cut the tension now. You can see Rob concentrating and focusing on which pick away. It's great, the shift here.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Rob, but those areas where planes are over ships, I mean, it's just about impossible to select what you want to select, isn't it?
Oh yeah, where the planes are overflying here. Yeah, there's I guess it's what you would call a target-rich environment at this point. So So I'm not sure that we mentioned, was it the Kagi that was sunk last turn here? The Americans did get their first aircraft carrier. I think that was.
Yeah, I think it was the Akagi.
Yeah. Okay. So that is a watershed moment in the game. So we finally had our first flat top go down. But there's a large portion of the American fleet around Midway that is also, you can kind of see they're in shallow water here. So these are, you can see the wreck of the American cruisers. I think one of these is the New Orleans that was sunk. They're in shallow enough water. After the war is over, I guess we'll have divers going there to go see what they can bring up from those shipwrecks. And at this point, I'm having to kind of split up my airstrike because I was hoping to be able to use them to concentrate and maybe knock out another American carrier, or Japanese carrier.
Feel free to knock out an American carrier.
Yeah, right. At this point, I kind of need to shift over to Midway since the situation is critical there. We've got another merchant ship that's wanting to unload that's just a couple hexes away. So we need to do something about that for sure. And we've got the B-17 that's back over Midway trying to fly a combat air patrol over Midway. See if I can make some use of him. Let's see. I think I've done just about all I can do with them. All right, it's back over to you.
We also do have examples of a Japanese Zero and George at the museum as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that's always one of my one of the things that interests me as we present and do our own outreach activities, or when people come through, is to show archival documents or things from the Japanese side alongside the Americans. So we have different propaganda leaflets. We have some Italian things that were actually found down in Italy as well. But one of the more interesting ones is we actually have a map of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but it's the Japanese map that actually was the first spotting of the American fleets. And so that's always interesting. And we're working on getting that translated, actually, the notes and things like that are on it as well. So it's pretty interesting stuff down in the archive always. So.
Neat. Yeah, we have a few, a couple propaganda leaflets and then some surrender leaflets that were dropped over, some of these Japanese positions that held out, that were bypassed during the war, and had these islands that had small Japanese garrisons that still had people on them at the end of the war, and they were trying to let them know that Japan had surrendered and please come out and don't shoot us anymore. So yeah, we've got a few of those too. And what I've found, I don't know if you found the same thing, that we do have, because there are a number of international students at the Naval War College, including some from Japan, we have a couple people on hand who can help us translate those documents. But even for them, it can be not always easy. That World War II era wartime Japanese language does not quite necessarily correlate with modern day Japanese. So even with a native Japanese speaker today, they're not always quite able to translate military terminology that was used in those days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have a local college that actually has a center that does sort of Asian studies, and the modern Japanese students, even if we've sent it over and they weren't able to. So you definitely need somebody who has a little more specialized knowledge that can help with that. But We've had some pilots that have come through, and I always try to snag them when I see them on a tour and say, hey, I know you're busy, but...
You offer them a prize if they can translate the whole thing, or
yeah, a great digital copy.
Yeah, there we go. Everybody's doing NFTs today. You know, you can scan a document and turn it into an NFT, then make it worth $1 million at whatever people pay for them nowadays.
I still haven't figured that out, but yeah, it's a thing.
Very abstract concept. I'm not exactly sure why people are willing to pay millions of dollars for them, but for some reason they are. I'm pretty sure the ones that go for that much don't have anything to do with naval history, though. So we may not be in the right market for it.
Yeah, exactly right. Not a fundraising opportunity.
I will show one thing here as Jared, I'm going to cut away from you just for a little bit to show one of the pieces I wanted to show from the Naval War College Museum. Let me just share a different screen here. Okay. Here we go. So one of the documents that we have over in the archives for the Naval War College is kind of a neat, short little document, but it's actually the fitness report, the officer evaluation report, as they would call it today, on Admiral Spruance, Raymond A. Spruance, that was written for him by his immediate commander, Admiral Jack Fletcher, who was in overall command at Midway. If you look at the top of this document, you can probably see, so it's written in August of 1942. This is actually just after Guadalcanal is getting underway. But the period he's being rated on, you can see here, is April 1st, 1942 through June 18th. So we're going just up a week or two after Midway. So as any officer evaluation report form has, it shows, you know, his normal command here is Cruiser Division 5. Under additional duties, it's Commander of Task Force 16, which I always find as funny. It's sort of like, you know, when you apply for a job and, you know, it's extra duties as assigned, you know, for him, it's like, and oh, by the way, if you don't mind, we need you to command an entire carrier task force also. So, but that's all listed up here. The form is pretty basic. Over on the right-hand side here, you'll see the marks that Fletcher gave Spruance. And basically, if you peruse it real quick, as you might expect, he's giving him a very positive and very, he's almost maxing out on the scale here of being positive remarks. There are a bunch of categories here where every officer is evaluated: intelligence, judgment, initiative, force, leadership, moral courage, cooperation, loyalty, perseverance, reactions in emergencies, endurance, industry, and military bearing. And Spruance, Fletcher gives Spruance the highest mark possible in a lot of those categories. And for the ones that weren't the highest, it was just one step lower than that. But all of these were in what they would call the exceptional range of ratings. So he certainly scored very well. And at the bottom, there's just a note here where he's able to write a little bit about where Fletcher writes his kind of evaluation in his own words. And he's saying of Spruance, an outstanding flag officer who has proved his capabilities in action, has only come under my personal observation and command at Battle of Midway, but his actions on that occasion leave no doubt as to his character and ability. So it's just kind of neat to see all that summarized in this kind of very routine form that all officers in that period would have had these, you know, being written about them at regular intervals throughout their career. All right, let's go back to Jared. So let's see, we're at the start of turn 13. So we've got, including this turn, we've got 4 turns left here to see if Midway can hold on. And in terms of carriers, it's 1 Japanese sunk versus none on the American side sunk. So we definitely have more more action taking place around the actual invasion site than on the carriers themselves. I think right now most of the aircraft, well, I don't know, Jared, if you have most of your aircraft in the air or not. I'm actually seeing maybe you don't quite have all of them, but I can tell you, I think you've probably figured out already that all of the American aircraft are. So there's they're trying to make their weight felt here as we get into the last phases of the game. One of the things we'll probably see too, well, I'm already seeing it on my side, but just again, going back to wargaming at the Naval War College before World War II, one of the important lessons that they got from this, again, it didn't predict every single battle that happened in the war. They didn't necessarily follow a plan that they had worked out in by practicing it over and over again at the college, but it did kind of show them some general trends that proved to be pretty accurate. And one of the things they found was that in carrier battles, when you have a lot of aircraft involved, even on the winning side, aircraft are very brittle, and even the winner in a carrier battle suffers a lot of aircraft losses. And the games kind of showed that repeatedly, where when the two sides found each other and sent their airstrikes in, they wouldn't be good for more than one or two exchanges, and the aircraft at that point were kind of spent and used up. Some were shot down, some were just damaged, but even the ones that survived certainly had to obviously make it back and get repaired. Pilot fatigue may play a factor. So the lesson that the U.S. Navy took from that was the importance of building lots of carriers. And having carriers that had larger carrying capacity. So when they ended up building the Essex class carriers, the size of those was partly determined, and they were using data that they had gained from war games at the War College to factor that into the size of the hangar capacity for those carriers, because they really wanted to make sure that they could cycle as many aircraft as possible through there, knowing that these air wings would have to be pretty large to be able to take the losses they knew they were going to suffer and continue to be functional or effective on some level. And I'm certainly, as my aircraft start to make these bombing runs on the Japanese carriers, even as I sank the Akagi here, I took the torpedo squadrons and the dive bomber squadrons, and both kind of started to get whittled down a little bit. So even if I were to keep doing this over and over again, I think I'm going to use them up in another couple attacks here. So I have to be mindful of the fact that I have this weapon to use, but it's only good for so long, and I can't just keep using it repeatedly.
Back to you, Rob.
Okay. Now let's see. I need to share my game screen again. All right, there we go. All right, let's see what the damage is this time. All right, just fast forwarding through your turn.
We're getting a little rain and wind down here in Pensacola, so hopefully our internet holds up.
Well, if we suddenly lose you, we'll just assume it's some kind of a communications equipment failure or something that would have happened in the battle to make it feel like we're actually there. All right, so it looks like most of my surface screen around Midway is at the bottom of the atoll around Midway here. So I've got, looks like one cruiser, the Atlanta, left. And yeah, I didn't think that guy down there was going to survive too much longer. I got this one more troop ship that's just right next to Midway getting to land, and I don't think I've got enough firepower left here to knock him out. I've got the B-17, which I'm going to take a run at him, do a little bit. At this point, I may need to actually just keep the B-17 around to bomb the troops that are going to land. That may be more effective than bombing the ship itself. So let's see. Well, one of my Dauntless squadrons was expended there trying to attack that troop ship, so don't have too much left. I can strafe him with a Wildcat, which is what I'm going to do here. But at this point, I kind of need more aircraft to address the situation by Midway, so I think I'm going to have to break off from the carriers. I'm going to satisfy myself with having just sunk the Akagi, but I think at this point it's pretty much an all-hands-on-deck situation for protecting Midway itself. So if you're looking at the screen here, you're seeing this is where the American carrier force is. In real life, of course, they were split into two task forces, 16 and 17. I'm probably not giving away too much to Jared at this point to say that I didn't take that approach here. I've actually got pretty much effectively everything is together in one 3-carrier task force. So it's certainly paid dividends in terms of keeping them hidden, but I'm wishing that I had a few more of these. The destroyer screen that's traveling with the carrier task force might be handy to have these ships over by Midway at this point. So I'm running out of units to throw at you, Jared. So I'm throwing it back to you here. It's back to your turn.
The good news for Rob is that it's highly unlikely at this point that I'm going to find him, and even more unlikely that I'll be able to sink him in the time that I would have left if I find him.
Yeah, that's kind of the calculation that I just made on this turn here. Is I'm kind of stripping the carriers of their defenses. I'm just realizing that even if you found me this turn, you might not have enough time to send something down there. So it's kind of going all out to defend Midway. I think we've guaranteed at this point. I'd be shocked if I sank another carrier. So I think one of yours is probably about as much as I'm going to get. So if nothing else happens here, you've certainly sunk a good number of cruisers and destroyers. Haven't touched any of the American carriers, but at this point, I would say this is not in any way the smashing American victory that was historically. If I only come away from this having sunk one of your carriers, certainly that's not great, but that's hardly going to set back and turn the Japanese on the defensive. I've got a couple of the scout planes out there too that are unarmed, unfortunately. So while they're flying around and they can at least spot you, they're not going to be able to do too much to you. I think I should have just made this scenario a couple turns shorter, Jared, and that would have stopped you from ever getting close enough to the island. That's one way to win.
Yeah, Rob, so you said you had to make some adjustments, right, when you were creating the scenario?
Yeah, this is a custom made. So this game is available on Steam, and if you go there, you can see there's a lot of downloadable content too, which includes a Pacific module, and it does have a Midway battle. I made some changes to it to make it a little better for this program. So yeah, that includes just the ships that were there, the length of the turns. We've said in the past about how the aircraft in this game have to be toned down a little bit because they usually, unless the game is very long, the endurance for the aircraft lets them stay in the air pretty much the entire game. And when you see that, you think, oh, so they took off, on June 4th and they stayed in the air until June 6th and then landed. How does that work? When that happens in this game, you kind of have to look at this as each aircraft icon that you see here isn't actually one aircraft. It's really representing an entire squadron or even multiple squadrons that might be kind of coming on and off station. In reality, they might have a few, sending some to go out and attack and come back, and there would be more aircraft involved. So you can't really think of each aircraft unit really as one particular individual unit. It's representing, large numbers of aircraft. But if you had all of them in this scenario that were actually present in the game, I think it would be a pretty short, brutal, bloody affair since their ability to stay on station for long amounts of time really makes them, it shows the dominance of aircraft, of course, at this point. And then that's one of the things that, the Japanese really finally take to heart after Midway. Even at this point in the war, they still, had been, again, we were talking about kind of using their aircraft carriers partly as bait, but also as a way to try and get in a few blows on the American fleet. But they still kind of had the idea that the Japanese battleships were going to come in and really deliver the final blow that would kind of make the battle decisive. And after Midway, it really becomes apparent that, the battleships really are not going to have that role in this war. It's going to be much more of a carrier-centric kind of a war. The U.S. Navy, for their part, certainly, again, that was something that Wargaming at the War College certainly hinted strongly at. Sometimes the War College is criticized for some of the games where they were still playing games modeling the Battle of Jutland from World War I. They were still playing those games and studying it well into the 1930s. But if you look at the reports that they wrote of those games, you can see that they weren't studying World War I battles to necessarily learn tactical lessons or to figure out points of strategy that would have been obsolete by that point. They really studied historical battles like that, mainly to look for it in terms of lessons of leadership, understand the decision-making process that commanders go through in battle, the way that commanders function in very stressful situations when they have decisions of enormous weight and consequence to make under very trying circumstances. Those things tend to be more timeless, whether you're fighting an Age of Sail battle or a modern, at this point, modern battle in World War II. You could certainly learn a lot just by looking at the decision-making process that commanders before you had gone through and how they managed a battle. So that was really kind of the value of studying historical battles versus actually using them to gain, tactical or strategic insights. Mark, I know, the National Naval Aviation Museum probably doesn't have anything quite like, wargaming like this, but I imagine being focused on aviation, do you have like, a flight simulator or simulation kind of experiences for the audience there that they can do that are sort of your version of a game like this?
There are flight simulators, but there's not sort of combat involved. So we have a couple of flight simulators that will rotate completely upside down. And you're flying over, I think you're flying over Pensacola, if I remember correctly. I've only been on it once with my daughter. That was interesting. But, and then they have they have like the 4D theater, which you can fly along with the Blue Angels and things like that. So the newest one is actually a little further afield. It's a VR experience, a virtual reality experience of the Apollo moon landing. So you go up, rocket to the moon, and then come back to Earth. So that's sort of interesting. But no combat, but definitely plenty of flight simulators. And then they have the cockpits as well that you can, they're the trainer cockpits, which you can get in with various types of aircraft. No moving parts or anything like that, but you can get a feel for that, everything from helicopters to World War II aircraft, as well as modern jets as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're all pretty popular, particularly with the younger crowd. Or those aviators who haven't flown them in a while.
Yes. Popular with kids and adults with strong stomachs, right?
Yeah. Well, even the cockpits of like the aircraft they might have flown in their previous career. So
sure,
that's always fun to see, and then to hear their stories. You look like you got quite a conversion going on here at a convergence on Midway.
Yeah. Now this is again sort of the hex grid kind of dictates this, where you have kind of this big traffic jam here. But I think we definitely have a traffic jam situation on the approach to Midway. So let's see what we can do about that. Probably not much, though. I'm not very confident that we can hold on for another 3 turns here.
Yeah, there's a lot of red.
Spruance may not be receiving this glowing fit wrap that he got in reality, in the game, the Spruance in the game, at least. Towards the end of the first day, we talked a little bit too about sort of the relationships between the commanders, the principal commanders on both sides, and how important that is, of course, and how important the teamwork in the upper command structure is for a battle of this size and importance. And Fletcher and Spruance certainly, had a level of trust there, where they were able to operate somewhat independently of each other. Fletcher, of course, is in overall command, but he trusts Spruance with a lot of his own decisions. Both of these guys are not aviators, not carrier admirals by training. They all come up as surface warfare officers. They come up in cruisers and destroyers, and have to really rely on some of their staff who are aviators to kind of help them learn on the fly. No pun intended, but they figure out the finer details of carrier operations. And I think both of them do that pretty well towards the end of the first day.
Rob, I had to interrupt you. I just wanted to let you know it was your turn.
Yes, thank you. Yep, I'm loading up right now.
Okay, sorry.
The Yorktown is, sinking towards the end of the first day. It's been abandoned, or they've gotten everybody off the ship, but it hasn't sunk yet. But at that point, Fletcher, who had been in command of the overall command, but he was also had direct command of Task Force 17 with the Yorktown. When his flagship had been shot up from under him, he kind of was left without a carrier in his task force that he was exercising direct control over. And at the end of the first day, there's a kind of at the end here where Spruance radios him and asks if he has any instructions as they are reaching the end of June 4th. And they've had, of course, the amazing success of finding the Japanese carriers and sinking the 3 and close to finishing off the 4th. And he's asking Fletcher for instructions, and Fletcher basically tells him, I don't have any. I will follow your lead from this point, since Spruance was the one with carriers under his direct command at that point. So it kind of is an event that's often used to show how much Fletcher trusted Spruance and his judgment, and was willing to kind of follow his lead, even though he was the overall commander at that point. Well, I see Japanese troops on Midway, which is not a good thing for me. Let's go through all of this.
And of course, one of the part of the background for the original Japanese operational plan was that to be able to carry it forward initially, it had to be all naval assets. So originally that would have been a Japanese Naval Special Landing Forces, which is the Japanese Navy's equivalent of Marines, basically. And the Army was willing to let them do that because they didn't have any resources in that operation. Then you get the Doolittle raid, which is an embarrassment not just to the Navy but also to the Japanese Army. And so the Army at that point very generously agrees to provide some troops for the invasion force.
Yeah, boy, it looks like you have done very well in just kind of overwhelming the Midway defenses here, Jared. Let's see here. I can torpedo a remaining troop ship, but I'm just not sure I'm going to be able to do anything about the Japanese that are already on the island. Oh boy, yeah, you've done a number on the remaining American aircraft, I see. I'm basically down to a few B-17s. We've got Fighter Squadron 3 and Torpedo 8 over here. And that's it in terms of aircraft, which is pretty bad. I've got a little bit else that can come over to here to help, but my carriers that are kind of safely down here are, and their destroyer, the escorts that are, the destroyers that are escorting them are not really going to be able to make it up here in time to help help with the defending Midway. So, yeah, Jared, you know, I sort of, I know we've got 3 turns left here, but I think we've probably hit the decision for the game, the decisive point here, because I know you're on Midway Island here, and there's really nothing I can do to stop you at this point. So it looks like you're safely ensconced on the island and are going to take over the rest of the base here. And as we said, yeah, the Akagi did go down. I had to strip off all the other aircraft to come fly over here to Midway. So I don't think we're going to see any more Japanese carriers going down. I guess the one thing I can say is the Yorktown isn't sinking as it did historically. I've got the American carriers that are down here on the southern part of the board. So Jared, I basically took the opposite approach as they did historically. I'm kind of coming in along the very bottom edge of the board and keeping them all together. So I'm kind of approaching from the south rather than the northeast, which at least worked to keep them hidden. But I guess for me, as I'm thinking now, maybe they were too far away from Midway, and I probably didn't count on you sending quite as much directly to Midway as I should have, given the fact that that was the main objective for the game. So I'm afraid, I hate to say it, Jared, but I think I have to hand you pretty much the victory on this. You've got Midway Island, you're going to take it over, and you've lost one carrier, and you haven't sunk any of mine, so that's a slight advantage. But the main condition for the game, at least in game victory conditions, is to take Midway Island, and you've definitely done that. So I'm afraid I have to hand you my sword here and say game over and well done.
Can I at least take my turn and make it official?
You want to play it out? Sure. Here, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I'll take those last 2 hexes, and that'll be enough.
Okay. You can see it all. See those flags turn over to the Japanese side, and then it'll be official.
I mean, after 3 weeks, I feel like I'm at least entitled to.
You've earned that much. I will give you that. You've earned it.
So, Mark, while we're oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we'll be expecting that NHHC trophy to come over down to Pensacola for the war.
Need to have a traveling trophy made up here.
Go ahead, Jared.
I was going to say, Mark, now that we're wrapping up this turn, do you have it? Because you've watched all 3 parts, and obviously I wasn't watching Rob, and he wasn't watching me. So, do you have any just general observations about the way things unfolded?
Well, just from the game perspective, right? So,
yeah, just from the game.
Yeah, no. I mean, it was interesting that you each had 2 sort of forces on the complete opposite ends of the map that didn't really do anything. I mean, in the sense, you had your northern group, Jared, that I mean, they were scouting a little bit, but in the end, they were just removed. Whereas Rob had his in the complete southern end, and they were also removed. The only slight advantage was then you weren't able to find them and sink one. But as he pointed out, in the end, for a game, perspective, it's certainly the main objective is Midway, and you just flew in. I was always interested to see how it played out when the planes would, that huge flight. I was kind of, that you brought in, Rob. I was like, whoa, like this is going to be
yeah,
this is going to be quite a thing. And it's just, I think there's just so many ships because the Japanese forces weren't split like they were in the history books. So having that many more ships and just having that fleet is that counterfactual we were speaking of.
mm-hmm.
For sure. I mean, it was pretty intense there.
It felt good launching this massive, well-coordinated airstrike from all 3 carriers, where they were all coming on target at the same time, which is what obviously Fletcher and Spruance would have loved to have had that happen in reality, and it didn't work out that way at all. But I thought I would have that the weight of that attack would play out more than it did. But yeah, I mean, you see the advantage in the game, especially anti-aircraft fire is more effective when you have your ships close to each other like that. And usually it works out so that if I am attacking a ship, any ship that's adjacent to that target ship gets to also shoot at the attacking aircraft. So you get kind of this effect of anti-aircraft fire coming from multiple sources, and it really, wears down the attackers pretty quickly. So, I felt, I had that southern group of my carriers, like you said, that kind of stayed well out of sight, and took a little bit while for it to develop. But I mean, their aircraft did get into the battle, which was the main thing. So I felt like I was using them, and I at least used them to good effect. And they sank the Akagi, so I guess I have that as a consolation prize. But
I'll definitely say I'm glad we went with the split we did, where Jared is the avid fleet commander and I stuck to the historical components I could present on. Because I'm sure you would have fared much better against me had I been the one moving the ships and the aircraft. So.
Well, I was hoping that, I sort of, as you see, I had the carriers concentrated on one side, and then the surface fleet concentrated around Midway. And my thinking had been that if I kept that surface fleet together, as we saw in reverse here, if they got attacked by Japanese aircraft, just by keeping them adjacent, they would help fend them off, and weather that storm okay. And that if he really tried to come close to Midway, I would have a lot of surface firepower that would keep him away. But yeah, it wasn't nearly enough. I really needed more than what I had there. The Japanese aircraft, and then once his surface fleet came into range, I mean, he definitely he had a weight of shell advantage over me there when he had a battleship and a couple cruisers versus my just largely cruiser and destroyer force. So I was outgunned there, and that didn't help.
Yeah, and if they had that northern group as well, like man, I mean, it's
Yeah, I'll show you this, Rob. I said now you can't tell what they were doing because I dispersed them trying to figure out where the heck you were hiding. But originally, this was a comprehensive or a cohesive group around one of my light carriers, and also had a destroyer. And basically, what I was hoping would happen is you would spot this early on. I guess I was expecting you to come out of the north and give you enough that you would try to attack it, but you never saw it.
That's really funny because I don't know if you remember, I had just I think you spotted them earlier on. There were two ships up there on the northern side, two destroyers I think I had.
It was a cruiser and destroyer. My submarine spotted them.
That's right. And I had the same thought. I was hoping you were going to spot them. I knew you had a submarine in that area, and I thought you would spot them and decide, oh, that must be the Vanguard. They're all coming in the north, and you would throw everything up there. So that's funny. We were both using the northern side as like the decoy for us.
And I did say in the first game, I provided kind of an Easter egg. If you look at my avatar, that is not Admiral Nagumo. It's not Admiral Yamaguchi or Admiral Yamamoto. That's actually Admiral Ozawa, who was in charge of the decoy force at Leyte Gulf. So that's why I chose that.
He played his part well. Yeah. No, that's funny.
So well, you never saw him and never attacked him.
So yeah, I'm gonna have to, when we have to go in to see the losses here, or you might be able to. I'm not actually. If you click on that force button, I think it doesn't show you the losses. We'll have to total it up afterwards. But I think I lost every single cruiser that I had, and a good number of destroyers as well.
Yeah, three down here, one up here, and then the Atlanta,
and then the entire Midway garrison, of course. So, I'm afraid this is basically shaped up to be an American disaster. This was a pretty decisive Japanese victory, I would say, and you've delayed the war, I would say, probably by at least a good full year at this point. If I had to make a wild guess about it, I would say a disaster of this proportion. I think Fletcher and Spruance are probably both headed for death jobs at the Pentagon, or not the Pentagon, in D.C. for the war. They may be probably a few changes in command here on the U.S. side. And, the carriers haven't been hit, so I guess they can still build on that. But I think the headlines in the U.S. newspapers are not going to be very favorable in this scenario. So,
yeah, to the question that was posed, I think more than logistically, this would be such a morale blow to the U.S. and the populace. I mean, that would be even more devastating, I think, than the island itself.
This is kind of just continuing the story of the first few, 6 months of the war, where it's just kind of, defeat or at best, draws at the hands of the Japanese. But yeah, this is not going to help. So,
well, and the other aspect of it, even though the carrier survived, the losses to the air group were basically complete. And between Yorktown and Enterprise, that would be losing your best pilots, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a lot of, you're right. The air crews are going to have to be retrained for the Japanese, your pilots and your maintenance crews that were the things that really were sort of the things that were almost irreplaceable, or that took so long to replace that it was hard to really momentum once it was lost. For you've lost very little of that. So I think the Japanese are going to be able to continue their advance across the Pacific, at least for a little while here. I think the question that always comes up for hypotheticals like this is like, would they have stood a chance at actually invading Hawaii and getting Pearl Harbor? I guess that would be, if they had Midway as a base, that would probably be like the next big target on the horizon. They might be thinking about, maybe at this point Yamamoto has enough prestige that he can suggest taking a hit at it to knock out Pearl Harbor as a base, and maybe that would be something that was within the realm of reason given these results at this point. But I tried to make some adjustments to my plan from the beginning. Like I said, peeling off the aircraft that were going against your carriers to come to Midway's defense. But I tried to kind of adapt a little bit and not just stick with my plan no matter what. But yeah, I think for me, it almost felt like by the end I was too spread out. I think I would have liked to have those carriers and their escorts closer to Midway than they were. It helped to hide them, but it didn't help me defend Midway in the end. So I think I probably would have done that differently. I mean, Jared, you won, so it's hard to argue with success. But is there anything you think you would have wanted to do differently if we played this again?
I think I had moved the submarine to the south, more to the middle, and I think I really should have left him where he was to start. Other than that, I was pretty happy with it. I mean, I knew roughly where you were. I just never could find you.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, those carriers are going to have to get back to Pearl Harbor pretty quickly, and or they may even be going all the way to San Francisco at this point to say they need entirely new air groups at this point to fit them out. So, not too many other places they can replace those losses. So, yeah, this is not good news for the U.S. side. So, all right, well, guys, I think we're gonna call it here for tonight. So that ends this game. So that's game, set, and match, the National Naval Aviation Museum. Well done. But yeah, thank you, Jared and Mark, both of you, for taking part in this and playing. Jared, you did great. You're a great opponent. Happy to play you. I'd like to do this again at some point if we can in the future. Especially since I lost, of course, I want revenge. So.
We had a great time, Rob. It was a lot of fun.
Best of three.
Thanks for the invite and giving us a chance to show a little bit from our collection that's usually not out. So that's great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, guys. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end it here, and we'll have this video will be up again on our YouTube and Facebook channels. So if you came in midway, if you didn't catch the beginning of this, you can always go back and see the replay there and check out the other games that we've done too. We will be doing this again in the future. I don't know. We haven't had it scheduled yet for when the next game will be, but as soon as we have details about that, we'll of course post it on our social media channels and let you know. But thanks everyone for watching, and we'll have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.